The first half of 1 Corinthians dealt with Paul's response to a report that came to him from Chloe in 1 to 6. And now the second half of 1 Corinthians is Paul's answer to a series of questions that the Corinthians have for him. And each of these questions begins with the formula, now concerning this subject, now concerning this other subject. And we're going to begin with the first one here in chapter 7, now concerning marriage. But the word marriage isn't used in their question. Let's see how they phrase their question to Paul. In chapter 7, they say, now concerning the matters about which you wrote, and this here in red are the words, we presume, of the Corinthians themselves. They say, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. And you think about the worldview there in Corinth, how the same worldview can result in two opposite expressions. And that worldview is that the body is bad, the spirit is good. And one expression of that worldview is, hey, the body's bad, doesn't matter what I do with the body, I'm going to go visit a prostitute. And then another expression of the same worldview is, the body is bad, why? I have to divorce my wife so I don't have sex anymore. That's the other expression of the same body is bad worldview. And Paul responds to it with what he calls my rule. He says, my rule is that you remain as you are. In the same condition in which you were saved, stay in that condition and do so because of the present distress. And you can kind of dive into the commentaries to see what most people think that means. But let's look at that rule of Paul and how he applies it to these different groups. Let's look at verse 17. My rule. What is your rule, Paul? Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned him, to which God has called him. In other words, remain as you are. This is my rule in all the churches. Now let's look at a couple of examples he gives us to kind of clarify this. Verse 18, was anyone at the time of his call circumcised? Well, stay in that condition. Let not him seek to remove the marks of circumcision. I'm not sure how he would do that. Next example, was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Well, then don't seek circumcision. Were you a slave when you became a believer? Well, don't worry about it. Do not be concerned about it. Were you free? Well, then don't become a slave. And he's going to then apply the same rule, remain as you are, to those who are married and those who are unmarried. So remain as you are. If you're married, do not get a divorce. I mean, that seems pretty obvious, but he feels it's necessary to say. But then he says, if you are unmarried, do not marry. And before you freak out, Paul is definitely going to qualify this pretty heavily. This is a long chapter, and let's try to figure out what his reasoning is behind an application of this rule to this unmarried group. So let's look now at verse 8. Scroll up a little bit, kind of jumping back and forth. Look where he says that the unmarried should stay unmarried. To the unmarried and to the widows, I say, hey, it's good for them to remain single, as I am. Then down in 27, he says, hey, are you free from a wife? Well, don't seek a wife then. Okay, all right, we need you to explain what you mean by this, Paul. And what he's saying is that I want to secure from you, unmarried person, your undivided devotion to the Lord. For I know that a married man is anxious about things of this world, how to please his wife. And the same is true with a married woman. She's anxious about how to please her husband. And this is a good thing. But Paul says, I want you to be fully devoted to the Lord. And he recognizes that, hey, I wish everyone was as I am. But he knows that's not the case. And he says that it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So the unmarried, this is his advice. Do not marry or marry. If you cannot control your passions, it is not a sin. He's going to repeat that twice in this chapter. Not a sin to get married. But this is his rule and his answer to the question about marriage. Now let's look at, but before we move on, I think it is important for us to dwell for a moment on the significance of the gift of singleness and how it can be used mightily in the church. Not all people have this gift. I would say the vast majority don't have this gift, but those who do and who are fully devoted to the Lord can be used powerfully by him, like Paul was. All right, let's look now at the next now concerning food offered to idols. So imagine you are shopping. It's Saturday, and Saturday's the day you go out every week to go shopping. Now I go to Trader Joe's to get my shopping done, but these guys, they went to the local meat market, and they don't know necessarily whether this meat was offered to an idol, and perhaps there was leftover meat. They brought it to the meat market, and now you're buying food that may be offered to an idol. And the Corinthians say, is it okay? Can I eat food that's offered to an idol? And it seems like there is a strong contingent within the Corinthian church that says, yeah, sure you can. I mean, all things are lawful for me. Come on, no big deal. And Paul is going to agree with them, but his agreement is going to take the form of yes, but. Yes, but. And this form is actually pretty common throughout 1 Corinthians. Paul will agree with an element of their position, but he'll agree with it for a different reason, or he'll add a whole lot of qualifications to that statement. And that is certainly the case here. So here in chapter 8, this indicates that we're in chapter 8. He says, yeah, you can eat food that has been offered to an idol because, hey, idols are nothing. It's a piece of wood. It's a piece of metal. It doesn't matter. Yes, but do not give offense to anybody. If there is someone in your midst who is offended by eating food offered to idols, who thinks that is sinful, and you eat it in their presence, and they think, well, I guess I should eat it too because you're eating it, but they think it's sinful. When they eat it, it says they will be destroyed. And what's meant by that is that it is a sin for them. It's sinning against their conscience, and they'll be, judged by that. They're still going to be saved, but it's against them. It's negative. And Paul says, give no offense to anyone. Instead, I want you to surrender your rights. You have the right to eat that food, but surrender that right, just like I have. And he makes this argument here in chapter 9. Let's take a look at this. Paul, he's got a lot of rights because the guy's an apostle, but he says, I've surrendered those rights. All right, chapter 9. Paul is so personal in these letters to Corinth. It's really, really great. He says, hey, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? I got rights, man. Verse 4, do I not have the right to eat and drink? That's a reference to chapter 8 here. I've got the right to eat and drink food offered to idols. Do I not have a right to take along a believing wife with me, just like Cephas does, just like Peter does? Yes, I have that right. And he's pointing back to chapter 7 here with his teaching on sexuality. He says, I have that right. And then he says again, do I not have a right to earn a living by preaching the gospel? Yes, I have that right. But he says, look at this again and again, but I have not made use of this right. I have not made use of these rights. I did not make a full use of my rights in the gospel. And why? Why did Paul choose to surrender his rights? First off, he did so that he would not remove his grounds for boasting. There's a good kind of boasting, it seems. His grounds for boasting is that he preaches the gospel free of charge in Corinth. Don't remove my grounds for boasting by saying that I should receive a whole lot of money for preaching the gospel, just like all of those eloquent speakers in Corinth probably did. They got rich off of their speaking. Paul's like, I'm not going to do that. Secondly, he surrenders his rights so as not to make an obstacle for the gospel. So that's where we get the phrase, to the Jew, I became a Jew. To the one who was under the law, I became as one under the law. Even though I'm not under the law, I am not required to observe the old covenant laws. I'm a new covenant believer, yet I will act like an old covenant believer if I may save someone who's under the old covenant, save a Jew. I've surrendered my rights, so you ought to, Corinthians, surrender your rights as well. Now, Paul is going to give another qualification to this discussion on eating food offered to idols. And he's going to change the conversation or the location from the meat market in chapter 8 to the idol feast in chapter 10. So if you do a little bit of research on the culture and the history of Corinth, it seems that there were these idol feasts that were pretty popular forms of entertainment in which it would be an evening gathering. A bunch of people would get together and they would hear some eloquent speaker give an oration on some subject or recite some poem or something like that. And everyone would be eating a bunch of fancy food. They'd probably offer some of it to some Greek god. And then I guess it seems that they might have a prostitute kind of as a companion for the evening. That's no good. Well, Paul is going to say that while idols may be nothing, I agree with you there. Idols are nothing. But guess what? Demons are real. You go to those idol feasts like that, that is a den of demons. And I would not have you be a participant in the worship of demons, just like you're a participant in the blood of Christ and the body of Christ when you celebrate the Passover. Do not be a participant in the worship of demons. And then he's going to give this like strict and scary warning where he references 4 different occasions where our fathers perished in the wilderness as they were brought out of Egypt and they were traveling through the wilderness to the promised land. And it says 4 times a contingent of those early generation died in the wilderness because of their sexual immorality and because of their idolatry. So here in this section, Paul is going to say, flee idolatry. Just like here in chapter 6, he said, flee sexual immorality. This is a big deal. Take it seriously, Paul says. So Paul has, up to this point, he's answered a couple of questions on marriage, idol food, and now he's going to jump back to a report. That's what my little clipboard is here. In chapter 11, he's going to address a report that he received from Chloe again. He felt it appropriate to return to responding to conditions in Corinth. It says in chapter 11, I hear that such and such. Here in verse 2 through 16, it is honestly a very tough passage, hard to understand. It is undoubtedly the most difficult one in the entire book of 1 Corinthians, but what is clear is that there were some cultural norms within Corinth and within the first century, and both within and without of the church, that men had their heads uncovered and women had their heads covered. It was a sign of their gender, I suppose. And men, Paul says, do not blur the distinctions between the genders, like our culture is doing like crazy right now. But men are to pray and prophesy with their head uncovered, and women are to pray and prophesy with their head covered. But he says, I commend you. See this in red? I commend you. Like you're doing okay. I mean, the culture around you, they may be going crazy, but at least right now, he says, Corinth, you're doing all right. I commend you for this. But then he flips here in verse 17. It says, but on this other thing, I do not commend you. You are in need of some serious repentance on this issue right here. And the issue at stake in this case is the Lord's Supper. When they come together and they celebrate the Lord's Supper, he says it is not for the better, rather it is for the worse. And it seems as if this issue of division is returning again here in chapter 11. It was addressed here in 1 to 4. It came back in chapter 6 with the lawsuits. And division is now creeping back here in chapter 11. And let's look at it. Okay, chapter 11, specifically 11:17. Now, earlier it says, hey, I commend you about this, but I do not commend you for this other reason. He says, when you get together, when you come together, is not for the better, but for the worse, because I hear that there are divisions among you. And see this word? Schisma, like schism. Again, it's returning. An important critical word here in Corinthians. There are divisions among you because the poor, they go hungry when you get together to celebrate the Lord's Supper, but the rich get drunk. So it seems that when they celebrate the Lord's Supper, everyone's bringing their own food with them, and the rich are like, all right, this is going to be a great time. They throw all their food over their shoulders, and the poor's like, I can't afford to eat like that. I can barely feed my family. So the rich are just feasting, and they're getting drunk, and the poor are hungry. And Paul is going to issue another stern warning. First, he's going to say, like, what is wrong with you guys? Like, can't you eat at home if you're hungry, oh rich person? Um, Rather, I want you to care for your poor brother. But he gives them this warning. He says that if you eat the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner, you will be judged, he says. And that he even goes on to say, like, that is why many of you are sick, and even some of you have died because you have eaten the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner. Therefore, he says, examine yourselves beforehand to make sure that your conscience is clear before the Lord. Well, having responded to that report here in chapter 11, he's going to return to another question that the Corinthians have in chapters 12 to 14. And this is now concerning spiritual gifts. So you remember, we made the claim earlier that the big issue in Corinth is a confusion about spirituality. They think they're very spiritual, but Paul says true spirituality, it should result in unity within the church. True spirituality results in unity. And his favorite metaphor, Paul's favorite metaphor for unity, is the body. The church, he says, is one body, one spirit, but it is composed of many parts, each of which have different gifts. One body, many parts. And he says that this design, it is completely intentional, and God arranged the body this way for a specific purpose. What is that purpose? That there be no division. Again, this critical word is returning here in chapter 12, that there be no division in the body. Let's look at that moment. All right, chapter 12, scroll down a little bit. Now concerning spiritual gifts. And see how there's these sentences of intentionality and purpose and design, where it says that, yeah, we are one body, many members, and God made it that way. God arranged the members of the body as he chose. He took special care to do so. He composed the body for a specific purpose. And what is that purpose? Well, look at this word that. He composed the body that there be no division within the body, and that the members of the body would care for one another. Now, again, division, so important in the book of Corinthians and important in Romans too. And the issue in the book of Romans was the Jew and Gentile divide. And here the issue in Corinth is this issue of spiritual pride. And it seems as if the Corinthians were very proud of their spiritual gifts, their exercising of the spiritual gifts. And with one in particular, what is the most public and the most visible spiritual gift? I would say it's probably the exercising of tongues, speaking in tongues. All the Corinthians wanted to speak in tongues. It says that they were eager for manifestations of the Spirit. And this one's probably top of their list. But Paul's whole campaign in chapter 14, now chapter 12, he said one body, many parts. Chapter 14, Paul's campaign is to prove that prophecy is greater than tongues. Now, see this? This is a little mathematical sign, greater than, less than. Prophecy, greater than tongues, tongues, less than prophecy. And it's for a specific purpose. It's because prophecy, the reason it's greater is because prophecy builds up the church, but tongues, it only builds up oneself. Let's look at that in 14:4. The one who speaks in a tongue, he builds up himself. But the one who prophesies, this guy's better because he builds up the church. Now he says, hey, I want all of you to speak in tongues. There's nothing wrong with speaking in tongues, but I want you even more to prophesy. And then he goes on, he's explicit as he could be. The one who prophesies, that guy, he is greater than the one who speaks in tongues, because it's all about building up the church. And look at this in blue. This idea of building up the church comes again and again and again here in chapter 14. And the reason that prophecy is better than tongues is because tongues is unintelligible unless one can give an interpretation of that tongue. And that kind of leads Paul to the latter part of chapter 14, in which he says that because God is a God of order, he wants his worship services to be done in an orderly fashion. So Paul's going to lay out just what it should look like. He says, hey, if someone is going to prophesy in church, then I want there to be only 2 or 3 people at most in any given service, and there better be someone there who can evaluate that prophecy. And they have to do it one at a time. And then same thing with tongues, 2 or 3 at most, one at a time, and there has to be someone to interpret that tongue. And then finally, in chapter 13, I'm doing this a little bit out of order, but I think it's helpful. While prophecy is greater than tongues, Paul's going to say love is greater than both of them. And why? He's going to make an eschatological argument, just like he did over here when he says that you will judge angels, he uses an eschatological argument. So he's going to do the same here. He says that love is greater than prophecy in tongues because love never ends. You see, prophecy in tongues, they do end. There's going to come a time in the millennium or the eternal state, the new heavens and the new earth, where no one's going to speak in tongues. No one's going to prophesy, but they will love. Love will go on for eternity. And then also, love is superior to prophecy in tongues because prophecy in tongues are worthless unless they are accompanied by love. When one prophesies, they must do so in love. And the same thing with tongues. They must speak a tongue in love. Otherwise, Paul says you're a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. You're just noise unless your utterance is done so through love. Well, that would be chapters 12 to 14, and that is one of the last questions Paul addresses. He's going to shift again to responding to a report from Chloe, this time about the resurrection. And it's kind of beautiful if you look at the grand structure of the book of Corinthians. Paul is going to begin with the cross here in chapters 1 and 2. He's going to start with the cross, but he's going to end with the empty tomb, with the resurrection. And the report from Chloe, it seems, there are some people in the church in Corinth who say there will be no resurrection, or they say that the resurrection's already happened, or something like that. But Paul says, no. If there is no resurrection, well, what does that mean? What's the implication of that? Well, then Christ has not been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then your faith is in vain, and you are still in your sins. That is how central the resurrection is to Christian theology. But it's also central to the living out of the Christian life. And he makes this point here in green, where let's take a look at that in chapter 15, verse 19. All right, man, chapter 15 is amazing. Okay, so Paul is making another argument why, yes, there will be a bodily resurrection. And he says, if in Christ we have hope for this life only, and we're not going to have another resurrected body life, well, then we of all people are most to be pitied. Now, what does he mean by this? We're most to be pitied. Well, think about Paul's life, right? I mean, Paul's life is not very pleasant, right? He's the last of all. I mean, he just goes from shipwreck to beating to beat up with the 39 lashes. He goes from imprisonment to imprisonment. Like, is this a glorious, triumphal life? No, it's not. Paul, according to Paul's theology, the Christian life in this age is a cross-carrying life. We are to carry our cross just like Christ did. And if there's going to be no resurrection and Jesus just calls us to have a horribly difficult life, well, then what's the point of that? We might as well eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. No, there will be a resurrection, Paul argues for in verse 1 to 34 of chapter 15. And now the second kind of question that they have, I guess it's, the report that Paul responds to, they ask, what will the resurrection body be like? And personally, I think that's a great question. I would love to know what my resurrection body will be like. But it seems, based upon the way that Paul responds to this question, that they don't ask that question with an honest spirit. They ask it something similar to the way that the Sadducees asked Jesus, what about, let's say this hypothetical situation, say a woman gets married and then her husband dies, so she marries that husband's brother and he dies and he dies and he dies and he dies. It turns out she had 7 different husbands. In the resurrection, whose husband will be uh, who will be her husband? And then they say, ha, got you there, Jesus. And Jesus responds to them, you fool, don't you know that in the resurrection we will be like the angels and have neither husband nor wife? So Paul says to the Corinthians, you fool, don't you know that in this life we bear the image of Adam, but in our resurrected bodies we will bear the image of Christ? And he goes on and says that what is sown, a natural body will be raised, a spiritual body, sown in weakness, raised in power. Let's look at that. Man, it's so powerful. All the way down to verse 42. What is sown perishable will be raised imperishable, sown in dishonor, raised in glory, sown in weakness, raised in power. And he's going to end with these wonderful words. When this takes place, when the resurrection of the body occurs, well, then death will be swallowed up in victory. And we will say, oh, death, where is your victory? Oh, death, where is your sting? And Paul is going to conclude this section with answering a final pair of questions that the Corinthians have. A couple more small questions. The first one is about the collection. This is a collection of money that Paul is gathering from the churches in Asia, Macedonia, and Achaia for the poor saints in Jerusalem. And he gives a couple instructions for how that should take place. And then also he shares some of his travel plans and also the plans specifically of Apollos and when Apollos is going to come and visit them in Corinth. Well, in our next and final lecture on 1 Corinthians, I'm going to attempt to just tie a big old red bow on the whole book of 1 Corinthians and see how all of these seemingly disparate ideas are held together.